First of all, Dr. Gerson and Professor Wagner is apologizing. They are a few minutes late. Something came up that they take care of, but they will be joining us soon. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Rabbi Rettig today to our seminar. Dr. Rettig is the acting director of American Jewish Committee Jerusalem office, and he holds a law degree from Hebrew University, a master's in rabbinical ordination from Hebrew Union College. A former Wexner graduate fellow, he holds a doctorate in Jewish history from HUC. He is currently working on a book about American Jewish-Israel relations. And our topic is related obviously to this, on Jewish identities in the diaspora in America and the Jewish identity in Israel. So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Rettig with us today. And our format is the same as usual. After the presentation we have time for discussion, so please keep your questions to the end.
Okay, I would like to, I don't know if this is the format or not, but if we can, I'd just like to go sort of quickly around the room. Your name, your serial number, and I don't know, one fact about you. Yeah, Corey.
I'm Corey. I'm working at Identities this summer with Dr. Rettig.
Corey is our Goldman Fellow this summer.
And David Parsons, Media Director for the Christian Embassy. Looking for way here today.
A comment from the Drug Distribution Director of the World Council of Jewish Communities.
Aaron Lopez, retired diplomat. I live and do both Australian.
My name is Wendy Diamond. I'm a librarian at California State University, Chico, and invited by Professor Israeli. And also, I was recently on a tour of American, more or less a delegation of American scholars, sponsored by Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, which you may have heard of. So I was on that tour.
I'm Rafi Israeli, a native local.
I'm Joel Fishman. I'm an historian and an associate with something.
Sean Ronstein, graduated at JTS, served as congregational rabbi in the States, and have been in Israel for 24 years.
I'm Françoise Bizan. I'm senior researcher at Tel Aviv University at the Diaspora Research Center, Goldstein Diaspora Research Center.
Ephraim Zoroff, Sam Wisdom Center.
Sarah Blazer, formerly Jewish Heritage.
I am Shalom Friedman. I'm a writer.
No one is perfect.
I'm sorry,
Oh, I'm Sarah. I'm an intern here from the States for 2 months.
and by the camera.
Thank you. No, I'm Ivri, New Alef, 10 months in Israel, and graduate of George Washington University.
And Maraika.
I'm Malaika, also a
Jonathan Porat, formerly with the Joint Russian Department for Movies.
I'm Artie Geldman. I'm a philanthropic consultant.
Aryeh Tuckman, research director at the Anti-Defamation League. Here on vacation.
This is a busman's holiday.
Arlene Kushner, I'm an author, investigative journalist, and law.
Jeff Dalby, I'm the director of the Israel office of the COA.
Okay. I am really honored to present here. I've been sitting here for many years on and off whenever I can get a chance. And what I want to do is talk to you about, in a way, about my own source. My background is actually, I grew up around the corner from Danny Elazar in Philadelphia. My parents were friends, and it's a secret, but Mrs. Elazar still has a chair she bought from us. When we made Aliyah, they followed a few years later. She still got the chair. I came to Israel when I was 18, and now that I know a thing or two about developmental psychology, I know there's a reason why very few Olim come at that age from the United States. It creates a kind of schizophrenia that, you have two choices. Either you go into a hospital for long-term treatment, or you get hired by organizations like AJC. So I was fortunate. I found one of the few places where my particular disability was considered an advantage. I have spent the last number of years trying to think deeply about why, fundamentally, communication between American Jewry and Israeli Jewry is particularly difficult. It is difficult in a sense that I would be surprised if a great number of us, particularly those of us who are American-born and Aliyah, have not experienced in our own lives. And those of us who are not American-born, who are not American in any way, shape, or form, but have had to deal with Americans and American Jews, have also experienced, but from the opposite side. I find that this discomfort is common. It's so common it's not even discussed. And one of my great teachers, a man I've never met personally, had this to say about familiar worries. The worries I will be talking about are very familiar. No one needs to be reminded of them. They are discussed, bemoaned, challenged, and argued against all the time in all sorts of media. That sounds like a reason not to talk about them further, but I believe that this great familiarity hides bewilderment, that we don't really understand these changes that worry us, that the usual run of debate about them in fact misrepresents them, and thus makes us misconceive what we can do about them. I want to argue that this, in a nutshell, characterizes American Jewry when it tries to communicate with Israeli Jewry. I am specifically pointing to American Jewry for reasons that I hope will become apparent in the course of this talk. To understand the Jewish world today, there are a few things we need to bear in mind. We all know them, but most institutions in the Jewish world have not yet really integrated them into the way we think. The first I want to call the 80% revolution. Most of Jewish history, certainly since the fall of the Second Temple, so we're going back about 2,000 years, we have lived in archipelagos of communities. These archipelagos have changed shape. They've moved around the world. The Jews have gone wherever other people have gone, and then they've gone a little further. But the fact is that at no point in 2,000 years have we had a single national Jewish community that was more than about 20% of the Jews alive at that time. This is a surprising thought, but if you stop and think about it, it is simply true. And even in that case, most of, yeah, it is. I don't know who mumbled, but it is.
Empire?
What?
Russian Empire?
The Russian Empire was not a single national Jewish culture.
Ah,
Vad Arba Haratzot in Poland was Arba Haratzot with distinctive Jewish cultures and distinctive national cultures in the various parts of them. What I'm saying is that we never had national Jewish cultures where any single one took up more than about 20% of the Jews alive at the time. And so this is the world that we still, many of us, still live in mentally. And in fact, if you go on the Jewish Agency websites, for example, that deal with the Jewish people today, look at the caricatures, the cartoons, and this is what you'll see. However, 80% of the world's Jews today live in just two relatively equal-sized national Jewish cultures. That is Israel and the United States. About 40% in each. By the way, I don't want to get into it too much. This is an easy thing to remember. It is possible, nobody knows for sure. You know, we have to ask demographers, and you know what a good idea that is. I have to say, I'm going off track. You heard a little bit about my education. So when I was in law school, I thought nobody likes to argue and debate like law students. And that's why they go to that, you know? They'll actually pay me a salary to do what I'll do over a beer for free? Sounds too good to be true. Then I went to rabbinical school, and believe me, as much as lawyers like to debate, rabbinical students put them in their back pockets. But I got to tell you, about 12 years ago, I started working seriously and closely with demographers of the Jewish world. Just to give an example, serious estimates. I'm not talking about people talking through their hats. It's serious estimates of the Jewish population of the United States of America by serious, highly regarded scholars vary by 20%. I mean, it runs from like 5.2 to 6.4 million. It's amazing. But that's the reality in which we live. I would be perfectly happy to accept that it's not 40-40, it's 50-30. I don't want to get into it, because the more important statistic is the bottom. Between 2/3 and 1/4 of diaspora Jewry today is American. Now, this would not be a major issue if America was like anyone else. But to consider what a harsh issue it is, let's go back to the Shoah. Let's imagine it's 1945. We look out at the Jewish world, and you have two Jewish communities that have the population and the infrastructure to create centers for the Jewish world. The Shoah not only destroyed, did not destroy humans alone, it destroyed the heart, the demographic heart, and the culture-generating heart of the world Jewish community. It wiped out that infrastructure, and it has never been rebuilt. You had then in 1945 two locations. One of them had about between 4 million and 5 million Jews. I don't care whose estimate you want to take. That was the United States. It was already structured with its current structure, more or less, plus minus of, Jewish self-help organizations, federations, it's self-governance, etc. And you had the state of Israel. Now, you had the Yishuv. Now, here's the interesting thing. The Yishuv in 1945 has about 500,000 people in it. But it has the structure in place to create a state. Many of us salute Ben-Gurion for proclaiming the state. In fact, I would argue that the man had so many achievements, but I would argue that his major achievement is in generating the thing most of us hate most about this country. It's bureaucracy. I heard a story, I've never actually seen it myself, but I was told that there are documents in the archives where people took letterhead from the Jewish agency, let's say, tax department, and crossed it out and wrote in the day after the state was created, the State of Israel Ministry of Finance. And then they wrote their memo by hand because there were no typewriters available, You think about what that means. Everything that Salam Fayyad is struggling to create now, Ben-Gurion created between, 1924 and 1945. And that structure stood the test, not just of the War of Independence, but of the first 20 years of independence. So this community went from about 500,000 to about, I'm thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, about 2.5 million by 1965. Like 2.25 million, 2.5 million. Now, what you have then are these two centers, and that has been growing. The American center has been rather stable demographically. The Israeli center has continued to grow by leaps and bounds. The problem is that these two centers are not contiguous with the infrastructure and with the civilization that went before. They are revolutionary developments, the two of them. Both the American iteration of the second half of the 20th century and the Israeli. And they are discontiguous linguistically, they are discontiguous conceptually. It's really a remarkable thing when you step back and look at it, not to say what hemshechiyut, what continuity there was, but to note seriously the break. Makes sense. The Shoah was the Shoah. What we came out of it changed. It's hard to say permanently, not permanently. Who knows? We all know who has to go on our day. But in point of analytically, there's no comparing. We do not think Jewishly. Our Jewish debates, our debates in the world Jewish community, our discussions, our creativity, you can see where the ideas are reflected in stuff before the Shoah, but what compares us with them, I would argue, is a high degree of discontinuity rather than a high degree of continuity. I'll put this in a sort of smarmy kind of way. I apologize ahead of time. But if I was wrong, we'd be conducting this discussion in Yiddish. Now, the problem, really, and here I think the Americans may have a problem, but everybody here who is Israeli born or comes from another country will immediately identify with what I'm about to say. The problem is America. I can see that, this is on tape, right? I can see the headlines in the Jewish exponent of Philadelphia, right? Former Philadelphian says the problem is America. But in fact, America is different, and it's different in a different way. America is the only country in the world whose cultural foundations were put in place by dissenting Protestants. America is a country that when you think about how Americans conceive of themselves, how Americans conceive of themselves as individuals and as a national identity, they build it completely differently. It is a country, I'll put it this way, the degree of individualism that characterizes Americans as Americans in many societies, perfectly functional societies around the world, is viewed, I'm not saying this as a witticism, is viewed as borderline pathological. And that being the case, we have essentially two Jewish centers that are working off of fundamental, different concepts of what it means to be Jewish, what it means to act Jewish, what it means to legitimize Jewish action, what is Jewish about being Jewish. All these questions we love to kick around tables like this are not just answered in different languages, that is to say English versus Hebrew versus French or German or Dutch or whatever. They're answered in different languages of meaning. American Jews really do talk different. I know that was ungrammatical, but there it is.
Speak differently.
Now, I would argue that this can go in one of two ways. Either, if you want to use the image of a tree, right, that has these two branches going off, either we can figure out a way that these branches will share a language of meaning, or we will essentially lose, or we are in danger, I would say severe danger, of losing our capacity to communicate effectively. A major part of the problem is not that we don't use the same words. We do. We just fill them with very different meaning. Now, Charles Taylor has a wonderful insight. He uses the term import vocabulary. Import in the sense of meaning, in the sense of how you fill words with content. And he points out, and he's of course following in a long tradition in Western philosophy, but he points out that values shape language. He points out that language shapes values. And I think his insight that I found enormously helpful is that, in fact, values shape identity through language, which shapes values, which shapes language, which shapes identity. In an ongoing, it's not even a cycle, because they're all working, all 3 points are working on each other at the same time. Import vocabulary, then, the concept, provides us with the key for addressing this conundrum of how we somehow bring those two branches to grow toward each other rather than away. Taylor points out that when our import vocabulary is different, our lives are different. The emotional lives of human beings from different cultures who have been brought up with very different import vocabularies differ very greatly. And even within one culture, people with different vocabularies have different experiences. It's that last phrase that I think we need to remember. The experience of being Jewish is going to be different in Israel, for example, from what it is in America. I would argue, without having the level of expertise that I hope I've developed about Israel and America, but about Britain, about Holland, about France, I would argue that this is true to some degree with all of them, but that with America the problem is the most profound because the American Protestant, small p Protestant I call it, way of thinking is the most different. And we're in plenty of good company. It's the most different for everybody. Everybody has a problem figuring out what in blazes the Americans are talking about. So we should not be surprised. I'm not saying this is a joke. I think America has a very deep problem communicating with the rest of the world because America is so deeply and profoundly different. Now, I want to go over 6, what I would like to call foci, or 6 import vocabulary. The first one I want to talk about is power. Power is, I would argue, one of the main discoveries of the Jewish world, one of the lessons of the Shoah, but I want to be very focused on this. According to Yad Vashem, 1.4 million Jewish soldiers fought against the Axis powers in World War II. 1.4 million. Had we been, just as a thought exercise, organized in one army, we would have been, I think, the 5th or 6th largest army in the war. And yet, the contribution of 1.4 million armed soldiers to fight against the Axis did not give the Jewish people, as a people, the leverage to promote the elevation of protection of the Jews to an Allied war goal, whereas an overt goal of the Axis powers, the Nazis in particular, in the war, something they were quite open about, was the destruction of the Jewish people, as a people and as individuals. That's the dissonance that we wake up in 1945 and we say, what hit us? Well, there it is. That's what hit us. Now, was it possible to have something different? I want to talk, again, this is a thought exercise. I'm not claiming a one-for-one, this is not physics. You can't write it up in a formula. But it is worth thinking about. The New Zealanders and the Australians contributed 1.2 million soldiers together. But at a difficult time, I think it was like 41, 42, when the Japanese were actually in bombing range. They actually bombed Darwin in Australia. The Australians were able to use their political power to generate a situation where the protection of Australia and New Zealand was elevated to a goal of the Allied powers, and troops were shifted from other places where they were desperately needed in order to protect Australia and New Zealand. Now, what this tells us about power, I would argue, is that this was not, as was discussed at the time and as was discussed before then, I have to say, both by anti-Semitic and pro-Semitic peoples, it was not a crisis of courage, Jews are cowards. It was not a crisis of mobilization, the Jews won't come to the flag, and it was not a crisis of faith. It was a crisis of political organization. We, as a worldwide people, did not have the political organization necessary to use to deploy power. We had the raw material for it. We had the 1.4 million people who were willing to put their lives on the line, which was, I think, one of the highest percentages of people. It was about 9% of the Jews alive at that time. It was one of the highest percentages of any ethnicity that was called to fight the Nazis. But we did not have political organization to take that and turn it into deployable political power. This is something that I would argue is shared, this insight, between Israeli Jews and American Jews. Shared, openly acknowledged. We can't go into it now, but there was a very complicated and painful process of about 20 years that sort of surfaced this discussion of is it okay for Jews to have power? Is it okay for Jews to talk about having power? And of course, America is a very different country. One of the things that makes it different is because the American system works from the bottom up, And Americans are guaranteed the right to organize for redress of grievances, as it says, on any basis they want. American stamp collectors can do it, and immigrants can do it, and Jews can do it. And so can Greeks to support Greece, and Turkish Americans to support Turkey. Because of that, it took a while, but the discourse surfaced in America. In Israel, of course, the Zionist movement has always, on some level, been about power. It's been about foreseeing the collapse of the diaspora attempts to exercise power in the classical sense, that it worked for 1900 years, and to find a new way, and that new way would have to be a state. But the bottom line is that today we experience power in very different ways. Israel deploys power and pays a price as a nation, in blood and treasure, in the civic and cultural costs of war. I would imagine that if we went around this room and took everybody's bio, everybody here who lives in Israel has probably given years of our lives. In my case, about 5 or 6, 7 years to the security forces in one way or another. And then there's Miluim that you do afterwards. And I'm sure everybody who lives here has had this experience. Our kids go out, and at the age of 18, when their cousins in America are going off to college, and having what many American Jews, many Americans in general, look back on as, sort of the carefree and most interesting, one of the great times in life, our kids are slogging through the mud in Golani and learning to do terrible things, and having a. Actually, I think it's a generally nasty time, but they're doing it, and they're taking away from that what comes with it. They pay an enormous price. Now, Americans pay in a completely different currency, and in many cases reflected in concerns over continuity. But I want to talk a little bit about how America pays and deploys power, how American Jews pay and deploy power. American Jewry is in many ways the most successful diaspora in Jewish history. I know that's an outrageously arrogant thing to say. My only defense, like in a libel suit, is that emet dibarti, I've spoken the truth. We have a higher percentage, just the 10 or so percent of American Jews who are Orthodox produce more yeshiva students than we talked about the Poland of the Four Lands at the height of the yeshiva civilization in Poland. We have more. We have a higher rate of basic Jewish education than we did in some of the the times in our national history when we were producing some of the most important of our rabbinic literature. The percentage of Jews in America, for example, who prepare for bar mitzvah, so they go through Hebrew school and they get a modest education, is probably higher than what people were able to allow themselves when they were basically a peasant society, for example, in Babel, which is the other era that comes to mind. When you think about the number of senators, the number of congressmen, the number of Jews placed in important positions, not just in this administration, in previous ones, when you think about the Jewish influence in politics, all of these are kind of amazing. When you think about the amount of money in the hands of Jewish people in the United States, you're talking about wealth that is without parallel in Jewish history. When you talk about cultural creativity, I would have to say that in many ways the American Jews put us in Israel in their back pocket. I'll just give one measure of the comparative scope. The Association for Jewish Studies, the last time I checked, has about 1,700 professors of Jewish studies. I've asked in several places. There isn't quite a parallel organization, I understand. In Israel, depends how you define it. But in Israel, we have between 200 and 300 professors who are equally, many of them are members there as well. When you look at it that way, the scope and scale of Jewish research, Jewish history, Jewish studies in a more narrow sense, and that's leaving aside the, few hundred larger yeshivot, the rabbinical schools that became rabbinical graduate schools that became rabbinical rabbinical-based universities that are among the top universities in America. When you look at the scale and scope of the American Jewish internet, when you look at all of these indicators, you see a society that is flowering and that is power. That interprets itself as power in the American public square, impacting on American public opinion, moving America many ways into a setup that Jews in America view as being in line with their values. And you find American Jews articulating this in the public debate in America, left, right, and center. So if everything's so great, what's the problem? Well, you know that voice that sits at the back of your ear? You know, I get up, I say, I'll put on my suit, put on a tie, really, blue shirt. I look okay to talk to people, and you look in the mirror, and that voice whispers, put on a little weight, haven't we, Eddie? That voice whispers in the ears of the American Jews, how long can this go on? Do we have continuity? Notice that the problem in America, and I'm looking at this at the moment from a power basis, the problem in America is not the problem we've known generally throughout our diaspora. It's also not the problems in principle that led to the theorizing of Zionism, modern political Zionism. The problem is not that the Cossack wants to burn down the shtetl, to use that phrase. The problem is that the great-great-granddaughter of the Cossack wants to marry the great-great-grandson of the Jew from the shtetl. I mean, we are facing a continuity challenge in America because of love, because of integration, because of failures in education, because of failures in conveying value. But this is a whole different set of our, what our, probably our hardware by now, and our brains has taught us to deal with as threats to our lives and threats to our country. The other point is that U.S. Jewry does not participate in Israel's wars as a whole. It just does not. The experience of military affairs in American Jewry is limited, even in the American context. There aren't that many American Jewish soldiers. There are, and I don't want to make light at all of their contribution to the American system and to the American war effort and all that, but as a percentage in the community, it's very slight. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is, or let me just wrap that up. When we talk about power, we have a real problem communicating, because power they fill with the power they recognize. Power in American Jewry is translated into persuasiveness, into having the tools to carry the day in Parliament, in the public square. Power in Israel tends to be translated into thinking about the costs and the needs that go into activating physical power in the way that a state activates power. Often when you see American Jews and Israeli Jews talking past each other, right, the thing where they're missing each other is that they're conducting parallel discussions based on their different concepts of power without being aware that they're different. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is another aspect of the United States as a Protestant country, and Israel as what I would like to call an Islamic, Catholic, Orthodox Jewish. Notice the only word I capitalized there is Jewish. There's a reason for it. I think that the Protestants did something for the world that America is the poster child of. America is the quintessential Protestant country. Israel is a country that has been formed almost entirely by people who arrived here from national cultures untouched by the Reformation. Now you stop and think about that. Okay, so what? The point here is that what Martin Luther did was to move, Martin Luther and one or two other people, to move the center of legitimacy in religious thought from an outside authority to an internal authority. This, by the way, helps to explain why American Jewry is more different than other diaspora communities. American Jewry is fundamentally American in that the center of religious legitimacy at the end of the day lies with the individual. I know that's a very broad statement, but I think if you think back on discussions you've had with American Jews about all sorts of religion-state issues, if you're not American, you will realize that this is where they were going in some way. Even the Orthodox Jewish communities in America, perhaps especially the Orthodox Jewish communities in America, have to address this. They have no choice. It's in the air they breathe. Let me give you an example of the difference. Islamo-Catholic, Orthodox Jewish societies like Israel, on the other hand, have a tendency to find religious legitimacy in tradition. In the instructions of a priest, or the instructions of a Qadi, or a Sheikh. I want to give an example from Chabad. If you travel to the States, you will see Chabad advertising. They do it a lot, and they use very sophisticated, they use firms from Madison Avenue to do it, and they're relatively effective. But you'll see that their advertising goes along the lines of lighting Shabbat candles, right? Chabad has this worldwide campaign to get Jewish women to light Shabbat candles. In America, it's all about me. It appeals to me as, mutatis mutandis, to me as a woman. Take a moment, a very special moment, that's only yours as a mother and as a woman, and share it with your daughter and help her grow as an individual, as a Jewish woman, and take that magic moment and light candles together. Now, when you drive into Ramla, there's a big sign on the side of the road that has the Israeli version of that ad campaign. And what does it say? Has anyone seen it? Kol isha v'chol bat madlika nerot Shabbat. Every woman and every daughter lights Sabbath candles. It is a flat normative statement. And then it has the time of candlelight. Why? Because we in Israel understand religious legitimacy in normative terms as given to us by outside authoritative, legitimate authority. Americans understand religious authority the same way they understand most other forms of authority, as ultimately a question of an internal process in the individual. I want to give you an example of how much harm non-recognition of this has done to American-Jewish-Israel relations already. And this happened a few years ago when President Katsav, then President Katsav, and the head of the soon-to-retire head of the Union of Reform Judaism got into a fight. Eric Yofi came off the plane and was told that Katsav had told Israeli radio that when he has Orthodox rabbis and non-Orthodox rabbis, he refers to the Orthodox rabbis in Hebrew as Harav, and the non-Orthodox rabbis as Harebai. So it would be, I'm just making this up, Harav Cohen, I'd like you to meet Harebai Levi. Now, he said this is perfectly okay. Well, Eric Yofi supposedly got word of this when he got off the plane, had an absolute fit, and announced that there was no way he was going to go to the president's residence for the was a World Zionist Organization conference. There was no way he was going to go for the party at the president's residence, the reception. He was going to boycott it in protest. Now, you know, our job at AJC, we get emails all of a sudden, what's going on here, find out. So I called the president's residence. They told me we're deeply embarrassed, we're very uncomfortable with it, but there was no party. So Eric Gilfie boycotted a reception that never took place, but he boycotted it. Now, that is just funny, and it's, you know, leadership misbehaving. But here's what happened 2 weeks later. They're both interviewed in Forward, a Jewish newspaper. Comes out in New York. It's the largest Jewish publication, I think, Jewish weekly newspaper in America, and it's online. It's a what?
Jewish Week is large.
Is it larger? Because I thought that Forward was. But okay, it's one of the largest Jewish. They're interviewed in I bet it depends who you ask. They're interviewed in forward. Now, listen to Katsav. Katsav basically points to his kippah and he says, look, you all know who I am. He used to do this a lot, by the way. It's part of his political persona.
We didn't know who he was.
What?
We didn't know who he was.
Right.
Little did we know.
Little did we know who he was. But he used to do this a lot. He's the kid from the Ma'abara in Kiryat Malachi, and he made it to be president, and it was a very important part of his political persona. And when I want to know who is a rabbi, I ask my rabbi. And my rabbi says to me, look, this Yofi fellow is a wonderful person, a warm-hearted Jew. He's done a lot for the Jewish people, but he's not a rabbi. So I can't call him rabbi. They go to Eric Gilfie. Listen carefully to Eric's explanation of why this is so wrong. He says, you know, there's 1.5 million Reform Jews in America for whom their rabbi is the central spiritual figure in their lives. Think about that. It's not, this is my words now, it's not that you're insulting me, it's that you're insulting 1.5 million individuals who have had an internal process and figured out that their Reform rabbi is the most important. Now, I don't know if the numbers are right. I don't know how many of my congregants, when I lived and worked in the States, thought of me as the central spiritual figure in their lives, but let's leave that aside. Think about the logic behind it. And what's so scary about it is that these two people, one comes up and talks outrageously about apples, and the other talks outrageously about oranges. I don't mind a debate. I think debates are good. That's how we built the Jewish world, by disagreeing with each other. What scares the living daylights out of me is examples like this, where we pass like ships in the night, where we are losing the capacity to even have a good fight. Now, constructing Jewish identity. I want to use two outrageous examples here, but I would argue that Jewish identity in America is largely a function of choice, because in small p Protestant fashion, identity in America is largely a matter of choice. And I would argue that it's fate in Israel, because in the Middle East in general, not just in Israel, identity is largely perceived as a function of fate. And I want to use two examples. Folks, you should meet my wife. My wife is terrific, Martha. We've been married almost 33 years. And I don't know, she hasn't run out on me. It's kind of amazing. But she has the option to do it. Our marriage is not just that we stood under a chuppah 32 and a half years ago. In a sense, it's a daily choice. And if you want to understand American Jewry, the example of our relationships with our spouses is a very helpful tool. I am Martha's husband in many ways, the way if I were in America, I would be a Jew. It is my choice. Hopefully I don't wake up every morning and say, oh my God, another day of being married, or another day of being a Jew, or whatever. But it's in that category of choices. I have choice. I have a way out, and I have to build my Jewish identity in the same way Martha and I have been together in a partnership to build a marriage. Now, you really should meet my parents. My parents are terrific. My dad is 86 years old. He still gets up, and twice a week he goes down to the airport with AACI, the Association of Americans and Canadians in Israel, and he meets New Olim, and he takes them through the labyrinth there with all the paperwork. I once gave a talk on this, and somebody stopped me and said, Albert, is that your father? Albert's my father. My mother gives lessons in English. She's a retired English teacher at Kol Chadash in Tel Aviv, and she gives lessons in English to kids who don't have the financial ability to pay. She thinks it's a key to taking a kid out of Yaffo and giving him a way to get into college or become a computer technician or programmer or something. I could not have chosen two nicer, better people to be my parents. But you know what? Nobody ever asked me. It just kind of happened. Not only that, there are all these other family relationships. I have a brother and a sister. I'm the oldest. Nobody asked me about them. Where did they come from? But there they are. And I tell you, I know this sounds dramatic, I don't mean it to be, it's simply a statement of truth. Twice in my life, I've put my life on the line. I've been in the Army, I'm in the artillery, so there's nothing elite about it. But I've gone to battle to protect them. These are some of the strongest relationships all of us have. Our parents, our relationship with our siblings, these are relationships of faith. Now, not only do we not consider them inferior because they're relationships of faith, when we see a case where a child is being asked to choose a parent, we consider it a tragedy. Right? A divorce, God forbid, or a death in the family, and mama remarries, and the kid's got to ask himself, well, what is Bill to me? Is he Ima's husband? Is he dad? And we look on the side and we say, oh, that poor kid, what a tragedy. Now, I would argue that America's Judaism is a Judaism of choice. Israelis' Judaism is a Judaism of faith in large, of course there's overlap, but in large measure, this is the truth. And if you want to know, this is a secret why the institution of Shlichim is such a dismal failure in the United States. We don't have a lot of time to go into it, but just briefly, we used to send people who were well connected. Today we send people who go through a series of selection based on their, you know, they have to have, I don't know what. It ain't rocket science, but it's the next best thing kind of people. And what we find is that we're sending remarkable people to be Shlichim in America, and it's not making much of a difference. Why? Because our best and brightest educators, you know, educators talk about having a backpack full of tricks. They have a backpack full of tricks for taking kids whose identity is a function of faith, language, geography, calendar, and teaching them to get the most out of it. They don't really have the basic tricks for taking kids who are in a supermarket of identities, who can choose, and you ever been in an American supermarket? Many Israelis the first time find it shocking. 1.5 kilometers of breakfast cereal. Well, their supermarket of religious ideas is just as complicated, just as long, and just as shocking. And you have to give them the tools to make Jewish choices over which you as a community will have very little control. Now the fourth one has to do with the difference, the fundamental difference between separation of religion and state and separation of church and state. Separation of religion and state is the French Revolutionary tradition. Karl Marx expressed it about a half a century after the French Revolution when he wrote in his essay that religion is the opium for the people. And in that sense, it's a wonderful, it is a wonderful metaphor. In this system, we treat religion the way we treat all those derivatives of poppy, right? In other words, we want to be free. The citizen of the Republic has a right to send his kid to school without having anybody mess with his head over religion or sell him heroin. On the other hand, Grandma's in the hospital and she's sick. Well, we demand that our government, in an orderly way, provide her with morphine to make her pain go away. We have people in our society, I hesitate to say God forbid, who are so primitive and undeveloped and unsophisticated that they feel a curious need for religion. Our state will undertake to supply it to them in a way that guarantees that the public square remains clean. Clean of opium and clean of religion. So the Archbishop of Paris may have strong opinions against abortion. If he takes them outside his church, he's in big trouble because he's violating the lay aspects of the state. Now, the American revolutionary tradition is the opposite. Americans have always been a deeply, profoundly religious people, and they set up a political system that protects their religion from the politicians. The French system protects the people from religion. It is an anti-religious structure. The Americans is a pro-religious structure designed to preserve the church from corruption by the politicians. It's too good and too important to allow the politicians to buy it on the cheap. Now, Israel, unfortunately, to my mind, has fallen, what goes with the hook and the sinker? The rod?
Line.
Line.
Hook, line, and
Thank you.
sinker. No, hook, line, and
Hook,
sinker.
line, and sinker, thank you, for the French system. And the debate in Israel is classic. Think of France in the 19th century. It's a debate over the whole hog. Bad expression to use. But the whole game is at stake. If the Dosim win, they've won. If the Chilonim win, they've won. It's a zero-sum game, and both sides know it, and that's why they're at each other's throats. In America, there is no zero-sum game. Because there's no federal money, there's no government money buying off, quote-unquote, or paying the salaries up. You don't have a situation where your local rabbi is a government clerk in the same way the director of your local post office is. When you get American Jews who have to talk to Israeli Jews about religion and state, and they have to deal with issues like a Rav Rashi, they do not have the tools. They can't understand, what is this guy? Why would he have any say at all over recognizing, just for example, recognizing conversions in my community? He doesn't live here. He's not one of us. Why does he have any authority over us? And why does he have any authority over anybody who doesn't want to be under his authority? My rabbi is the biggest genius on the East Coast in religious affairs, but he only has authority in our congregation because we choose to accept his authority. Now, 5, secular Judaism. This I can say very briefly, although it's a very big topic. In Israel, secular Judaism, that is to say, a self-perpetuating Jewish culture without God, is a fact, not only a fact of our lives, I would argue a central creation of Zionist history and Zionist culture. Think going back to Brenner, we're already talking about the 5th or 6th generation. You know, one of the great tests, anthropological tests of a viable culture is whether it can pass the generational transmission test, right? Secular culture in America that was based on Yiddish, all these Bundists who came to America and thought they could build the same thing, it failed. And within a generation, it had evaporated. In Israel, it is central. In America, it is absolutely marginal. It's not that there's any paucity of secular Jews, it's that there is a lack of any substantial secular Judaism. There's a small movement called humanistic Judaism. We pray as a spiritual exercise, but we don't believe there's a God listening. It's their basic theology. No, I'm serious. That's their basic theology. I don't know if you can call it a theology, philosophy. But it's, I don't know, maybe on Yom Kippur it's 20,000 people nationwide, and I'm probably being generous. Most Americans who are Jewish, who do not have some sort of religious connection to the community, face a really interesting quandary. It's not the classic quandary of Heinrich Heine, right? In Germany in the 19th century, which was, why be Jewish when I don't believe so much? Why can't I be a Lutheran who doesn't believe? Or a Catholic who doesn't believe? And not have all this discrimination. It was delusional then. But in America, the question is, why be only Jewish? If I don't believe in God, or have some connection to the Jewish community, even if it's just the fact that Reform rabbis get on my nerves more than any other rabbis, which is why I joined a Reform synagogue, even if it's not a tenuous connection like that, if I don't have that essentially religious connection, then why should I limit myself to 5, 6,000, 1 million Americans when I can be at one with 10 or 20 or who knows how many secular Americans there are? It's a small minority, but a small minority of 300 million is a lot of people. If you want an excellent example of the consternation this creates, AJC made a publication of it. I think that the tape of it is still online on our website. Aleph Bet Yehoshua went to our 100th anniversary birthday party and ruined it. You may have heard of the event. He didn't ruin it. It was a classic example where he had no idea what the Jewish identity was of all those Jews gathered at American Jewish Committee's National Conference, and they had no idea what they were listening to. Which brings me to the last thing. The trick with the Aleph Bet Yehoshua piece, when you go back to it, if you take a look at it or pull the publication off the shelf or print it out, is that it took place on Erev Yom HaZikaron. Aleph Bet Yehoshua blew his tongue. He did. I mean, you can watch him. He's physically twitching, really mad. And the reason, I think, is because, and here I'm being critical of my own organization, of course, but the reason is that there is endemic in American Jewish life a total block on this issue of Shchol. American Jewry is happy Jewry. I don't mean that as a criticism, I mean that as a diagnosis. It's a function of personal worth. You want to get American Jews involved? You cannot tell them that if they do not light Sabbath candles, they will be damned to hell. They'll say, okay, I'll go to the religion next door and see what they have to say about lighting Sabbath candles. But you can tell them, look what this will do for you, that magic moment. Once a week. Think of that Chabad ad. I don't want to sound superior. This is exactly what I used to do as a rabbi in America. When I would talk to young couples, I used to have a whole training thing before I would do their weddings. And I would talk about starting, most of them were totally non-observant, and I would talk about making Shabbat once a week. And at the time, I was in my late 30s and early 40s, and I had teenage kids at home. And so speaking from my heart, I would tell them, I promise you, there will come a time when through most of the week you will want to throttle your children.
Excuse me, sacrifice is not Shchol. Sacrifice is Akrava. Shchol is bereavement. And these are
sacrifice also has the meaning
it's two different words. And
okay.
I think it's mistranslated.
Are we clear?
No.
Are we clear? It means sacrifice in the sense of bereavement, if that's okay.
No, it's a different word.
Fine.
Different concept.
Fine. Okay. But let me just finish, and then we can go to comments. The point is that American Jewry is a Jewry of choice, so it is a Jewry that is, I would argue, much stronger on the happy side of Judaism, on the meaning-constructing side of Judaism than Israeli Jewry. You look at the kinds of books that come out of Ktav Publishing, for example, and what they deal with, and you compare them with what comes out of our religious publishing of all sorts in Israel. But also, I think this issue well, I mean it in both senses. Let me explain, because actually you raise an important point. It is sacrifice in the sense that I go off to war and I don't know if I'm coming back. I put myself on the line. In other words, I am a potential sacrifice, the lamb, going off to slaughter, hoping to, kick some of the slaughterers along the way. And it's bereavement, because people have to live with the fact that I didn't come home from war. I use sacrifice in that sort of general sense. But I want to say that I think that this goes back to the Protestant nature of American society. Christianity on death is very different from Judaism on death. Joseph Cardinal Bernardin was a man I knew a little bit. When I was living in Milwaukee, he was the Archbishop of Chicago, and he was truly a great man, remarkable human being, and he got cancer. And he got cancer, and he was cured. But then he came back, and he was told that he had, I forget, 9 months to live or something like that. And he did something remarkable. And you had to have seen the man in action beforehand to realize how at one he was with his own beliefs. He got on television because he saw an opportunity to educate his flock. And he said to them, he said to his chief assistant, now I have to live the things I've been teaching all my life. And he got on television and he said, For a person with my beliefs, death is a friend. And it had huge impact. I mean, first of all, half the city of Chicago was in tears. But second, it was what we call in Hebrew dugma yeshiva. This was an expression of Catholic and generally of Christian belief. Because for Christians, death is the point where you have the total confirmation of your relationship with Jesus. In a sense, it's what you've been building up to all your life, and Jesus' the main achievement, or the main sign that he is indeed what he purports to be, are the reports of how he overcame death, right? Now for Jews, you don't see it that way. So Rettig writes that the Torah was interested in life and repelled by death. Death in Jewish tradition is a tragedy, not least because death is the end of the capacity to do mitzvot. Once you're dead, that's it. You cannot do what is the main, I would say in Jewish thought, perhaps the main purpose for the existential answer to the question, what in blazes are we doing here? Now, it stands to reason that Americans respond differently to death as a group than Israelis. America is a largely Protestant culture, overwhelmingly Christian culture. Has anybody here ever been, among the non-Americans, been to America on Memorial Day weekend? Is it shocking? I once gave a talk on this.
Because they don't do anything?
That's all they do.
Shopping.
Shopping.
Well, I said shocking.
Shocking at the shopping.
I once gave a talk on this, and some guy banged on the table and said, "Now I get it." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I thought it was a sick joke. Because, you know, the fold-out page, like the back page of Maharid, the most expensive advertising, had a thing from a department store that said, 'Have a happy Memorial Day.'"
No, that's just the beginning.
You know, can you imagine in Israel somebody putting an ad in the paper that says, "Yom HaZikaron Sameach"?
No, but the Israeli ambassador to Germany once wrote to the foreign ministry, היה לנו יום זיכרון יוצא מן הכלל.
The problem with the American sense, and if you follow the history of America's Memorial Day, is that Americans have what, from a Jewish standpoint, and I can only speak from a Jewish standpoint, it's what I am, seems a very peculiar attitude toward memorializing their dead. Memorial Day is, by law, the first day of summer. It is economically one of the main days of economic activity in America. If there's a bad Memorial Day, the economy goes into a slump. I'm very serious about
That's
it.
the day after Thanksgiving.
No, that's the second one. That's the Christmas season. It's not one day. That's about 6 weeks. And the third, it is the day of the largest stadium-based sports event in the world, which is the
Indy
Indianapolis
500.
500 auto race. By the way, these used to be on Memorial Day, then they created Memorial Day weekend, so now they tend to be not on the day itself. I am the son of a World War II veteran. I grew up until I was 18. 1 year I spent on a student exchange in Israel, but other than that, 18 years in the United States. I do not recall once engaging in any memorializing activity on Yom HaZikaron. Now, this guy who banged on the table, just one second, was part of a group I was talking to about this stuff from Haifa. Haifa has this wonderful relationship with the Boston Federation, and it's been going on for 25 years. It started as Partnership 2000, then they created their own framework, and these people who had been having Israelis visit with them forever and a day had arranged for this group of what they call young leadership, you know, from about 25 to about 40, to go and visit and become friends with the young leadership, the next generation of Federation leadership in Boston. They were going to land, and guess what? They were landing on Erev Yom HaZikaron, and there was going to be a welcoming cocktail party. Now, the Bostonians had scheduled this absolutely because Yom HaZikaron, the Chalalei Tzahal, doesn't arouse a beat on their social radar screen. thing goes around, but it doesn't click. They don't get it. And the Israelis have simply not communicated that this is a sacred day. But here's the trick. More Jews, numerically more Jews, stand silently on Yom HaZikaron L'Chalalei Tzahal for 2 minutes. By the way, try getting 3 Jews to do anything at the same time. But here you have probably about 5.5 million Jews standing at attention or standing silent in Yom HaZikaron. That is about, I think, if I remember correctly, 1.5 million more than light Sabbath candles.
In Israel?
No, in the world. In the world.
Just the collective combining of Israel is able to outweigh
Only
the
women
world
can light
distribution.
Shabbat candles, so you lose your half right away. So
All right, but you lose half by not
First
having
of all, you're
half the
incorrect.
Jews outside of
Men
Israel.
light Shabbat
can,
candles.
but they
They
don't.
don't. But if you think
It's
about
already equal to begin
if you
with.
think about these numbers, and of course you're right, I'm setting this up as something that I hope will cause people to think twice. How does it happen that so many people do something that is so formative of identity, and yet the other 40% of the world Jewish population doesn't even have it on their radar screens? How does it happen that so much of the world lights Sabbath candles, and yet this piece of it is completely outside the realm of their Judaic consciousness? Now, why do I say this? Because the bottom line, I would say, if we want mutual commitment, if we want shared peoplehood and identity, we have to generate a shared international Jewish import vocabulary. This is not just tactics, it comes down to strategy. Because if we do not do this, take that tree image again, the branches are going to continue to go out, and I think, frankly, being conversant in both of the major streams of Judaism, that neither of them has what it takes, alone, on its own, to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We need the strengths of the two of them combined, which means we have to use an American image, find the language that will lasso them back and lasso us to them and pull us together. First, all right, that was question number one. First, you talk about it. You have to start to communicate. You have to start to say, look, you do not understand me. I don't know who to think worse of, frankly, if I have to be judgmental. Who's a bigger blockhead? The guy in Boston who set up this cocktail party on Yom HaZikaron? Or the 20 years of Jews who had deep, intimate conversations and never surfaced this issue? I don't know. Who do we condemn? Well, I condemn the blockheads and not the individual who made the mistake. We're guilty. We're guilty because these things are so important. Go back to Charles Taylor. They've become commonplace. We're just used to it. Americans, you've showed up everything. And we move on. But in fact, if we can bring this back, we can make each other aware. It's actually not that difficult. We can have these conversations, and you know what? When you have these conversations, something sinks in. And it has to sink in on both sides. You take Israelis to a synagogue in the United States, and they very often have a fit. And by the way, very often it's secular Israelis who have the biggest fit, because they know what a real synagogue looks like. It's the place they'd never be caught dead in. But you take them to a Reform synagogue, for example, where there's a rabbi who's pregnant and a cantor who's playing the guitar, and it's also a woman, and I don't know, I'm tempted to say, and they're married.
That's the point.
And then you tell them, okay, you can laugh at it, but just think, each of the families sitting there pay $1,200 a year for the privilege. This is all voluntary. It blows their minds, because there is nothing religious in this country. Even if you want to be voluntary, you have very few opportunities to do it. It's a whole different way of thinking. I think, by the way, that one of the reasons why we have never considered the separation of church and state in this country. is because we have this mental block against learning from the Americans. It's shocking that the biggest supporters of having an established Jewish church, in many ways the first in Jewish history, by the way, exactly in the sense that American constitutional theory talks about, are precisely the politicized rabbinate that's been bought off. I raise these because they're important questions, but they're important questions to be couched vis-a-vis each other. I want to say one other thing in regard to this. How do we deal with it? We also deal with it by not underestimating the problem. One of the reasons we underestimate the problem is because Zionist theory turned out to be correct. Every kid who goes to school in Israel and gets one of those identity projects, go home and ask grandma what life was like in fill in the blank. Marrakesh, Moscow, who cares? What was Shabbat like in Iraq, in Baghdad? Well, they come back with these wonderful stories about Jewish communities that are just where Zionist theory suggests they should be, or they would be. They're dead. They're gone. They're sunk. We do not have the analytic tools in Israel based on our personal experience because we come, 95% of us, come from precisely those communities that have dropped off, disappeared. We don't have the intellectual tools to go to a place that has a Jewish community that's like no other because it's in a country like no other. I'm not saying that it's positive or negative, just diagnostically. We in Israel do not know how to chew on that particular dish. Yeah.
Sorry, we already have...
you have a list.
Yes, so... Okay, let me put the names down, and we also don't have a lot of time. So I had Artie Gardner first, and then Professor Israeli, Joel Fishman, Nissan Cohen-Yan, who tried to give chance to everyone, Sarah Breezer, Ephraim Zura, and the three over here, Shalom Friedman, Jeff Dowler, and Edward Cohen. Just a second, maybe we can group the questions, because we have 10 minutes.
Or I can talk fast.
We have 8 questions, and I'm closing the list, so I'd like to take 3. Artie Gardner, then Professor Israeli, and then Dr. Fishman.
Thank you for a very, very enlightening presentation. Quick comment and a question. Regarding import vocabulary, how many times here in Israel have we heard Israelis refer or make a statement along the lines of "Lo dati," conservativity or reforms? Right? In other words, religion, he's not religious, he's conservative. What religion is, he totally different. In the 1990s, early 1990s, I served for one summer as a scholar in residence to a group of Jewish social work students, community workers from what was then the Baltimore Eaton College,
Hebrew University.
Right. And I brought them at the time to meet with Avram Borg, who at the time was serving as the Diaspora Affairs Advisor to then Prime Minister Perez. Right?
He's moved along since then.
And, he had the insensitivity in meeting with a group of young, idealistic, communally oriented American Jews to say to them in a very fatalistic and typically frank manner, Avram Borg, that American Jews and Israeli Jews share a common past. We share no common future. You agree with that?
Professor Israeli.
If I may, I would like to revert to my interruption of your speech before, the differentiation between bereavement and sacrifice, both of which are lumped together, I think erroneously. Because in this country, I think we have both bereavement and sacrifice. And there is a difference between them, and that's the reason you cannot lump them together. Because when you say sacrifice, it's a voluntary act. Like you live in this country, it's a kind of sacrifice. You volunteer, you go to certain things in the country, it's some kind of sacrifice. You come and you joined Gachal in 1948, it's sacrifice in America. And bereavement is involuntary. For example, you lose a son, which is very current, unfortunately, in the society, and therefore that is the shchol, and there is a difference between them. Now, in America, perhaps you know some sacrifice. That is to say, those Jews who join Gachar, for example, or even giving to UGA is some kind of sacrifice. But usually they don't know shchol or bereavement what is. And therefore I insist on the differentiation between the two concepts.
I'd like to make a few points. First of all, I think you've chosen one of the most important and most difficult subjects, which is the wholeness of the Jewish people and how to achieve it again if it were possible. I remember people spoke in the first generation of the state that there was a legacy of Eastern Europe and that people could speak to each other in Yiddish and they were close to the Eastern European experience. And now we don't have that, so whether or not it's possible to find the formulas, the identification of the question, I think, is tremendously important, and whatever you contributed is welcome and very, very important, and it's a very good line of research. I'd like to make a point about American Protestantism and the religious tradition, and Phil mentioned it. English translations of the Bible became available in the 17th century, and people widely read the Bible, particularly what was known as the Old Testament, and could form their own ideas about it and develop their own culture based on their direct understanding of what was in the Scriptures. This was one of, beyond Protestantism, which exists in Germany, for example, and many other places, the American or Anglo-Saxon idea of how the Bible fits into everyday life and applied politics comes from a direct reading of the Scriptures. And this is, I think, what's different and unique now.
Let me just say, you're basically, I did say it was put in place by dissenting Protestants, and what you're describing is the process by which they came to be, and I absolutely agree with you. It's just this was triage.
And it was one of these things that really changed the course of history.
Absolutely.
Another thing about Rabbi Jaffe, he's just not any rabbi. Maybe I'm very impartial, but I think he's the type of person who looks for a fight and tries to be as more obnoxious than is necessary. And one year he did not.
You are partial.
One year he ordered that the Reform movement should not send children to Israel because Israel was demonizing the Palestinians. So he's just not anybody, it's somebody who's gone out of his way to be particularly obnoxious. Those are my remarks.
That was 3. Okay. My answers are yes, yes, and maybe. Okay, next. Really quickly, I think your use of the word dati is a classic example of import vocabulary. There's no reason why dati should exclude a Reformed Jew who sees himself or herself as deeply religious, but in common Israeli parlance, they're excluded. It's an excellent example. Now, do I agree with Avram Borg? Boy, you really know how to get about it. I would say this, like so much that Avram Borg says, even a stop clock is right twice a day. Like so much that he says, if we do nothing, if we let this thing continue to move under its autarkic or dynamic, without intervening, he may be right. That would be, for him to say this 10 or 15 years ago is an example of a stop clock, and a man who gets his jollies by saying things that just sound outrageous and are thought-provoking. He would have made a really good Madison Avenue guy. No, I say that as a criticism. I don't think he's a serious thinker. I don't think he's a serious person. But, in fact, I think that sometimes these guys are good because they're weather vanes. You know, they have one skill. They know which way the wind is blowing, perhaps before the rest of us who have a deeper knowledge of the stuff can do it. The demagogues serve a purpose in society. If you want to discover the anxieties of a society, listen to the demagogues. Mayor Kahana spoke about Jewish women and Arab men. The intermarriage rate between Jewish women and Arab men was negligible, but he spoke about it. So you could tell that somebody thought there'd be pay out of that, I think, or is the
I
same
think he
thing.
thought he was being brutally realistic.
Yeah, I don't care what he thought, frankly. I don't think he thinks very clearly, and I don't like...
Since changed his opinion 100%.
Well, since then he's become provocative.
No, I think he made a great deal out of this. I heard that he did this. He's not the only person to go over there and say it. I think it's only true in the sense that my doctor says to me, Ed, if you don't lose weight, you could get really sick. And so there's two ways to do that. Somebody can be a demagogue and say, fat people are all going to die. Well, we're all going to die, but fat people will die sooner. Or your doctor can say it to you in a way that says, look, here are the charts. This is what you should look like. This is what you do look like, lose some weight.
Or you don't go to the doctor.
What I hope you're hearing from me is that diagnostic statement by the doctor and not the overarching and irresponsible statement by a demagogue. On bereavement and sacrifice, in the way you put it, I think it's true, and I accept, and I'm actually going to change this and use both words in the future. Because the point I want to make, though, is, and I just want to make sure that it's clear, is the difference. An identity of faith is an identity that does not give us choices. If our parents, God forbid, get ill, we take care of them. It may be terribly inconvenient in our lives, but we take care of them. On the other hand, identities of choice have all sorts of potentials for going off in different directions that are not necessarily there in an identity of faith. So we do suffer. And it has become, and that's why I say this thing about more people responding to this by standing at attention on Yom HaZikaron than responding to other identity indicators like lighting Sabbath candles. In terms of Rabbi Yofi, they're stepping on a blister here. I do want to correct one thing. When he canceled the youth things here, it was not because Israelis were demonizing Palestinians, as you put it. That's an error. He did it, you may recall, it was the morning after the Dolphin area bombing, and I can say my personal opinion is they panicked in New York. Their insurance people told them, wow, and they issued a very aggressive statement that they were being responsible toward their children. It was an awful thing to do because it handed a victory to terror in a very visible and powerful way. It was a terrible political misjudgment. It's not quite the case that you described. It wasn't because of an opinion about Israelis demonizing them. It was an responsible thing to do, if I can put it that way.
He did make that accusation. It may have been separately.
It may be.
But he did make that accusation.
Just Allenson never went into that.
No.
That is, you have here
Manfred, we didn't hear you.
David Ellenson didn't go in that direction. Anything like that.
No, Allenson insisted against the opinion of many that you couldn't become a reform rabbi without it.
Right, they would not cancel the reform. By the way, David Ellenson signed off on my dissertation, so he's got to be a great guy.
Yeah, we have 2 more rounds, so I would like to encourage everyone, since it's 4 o'clock already, to keep the comments as brief as possible. Sarah Beezer first, and Dr. Efrem Zurov, and then Dr. Shorov.
There's a word that should be in your vocabulary. I saw an advertisement.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Loud.
There's a word that should be in your vocabulary. I saw a booklet by Nefesh Benefesh and then Pirsomet, and there was one word missing, the same as your word. I think someone else understands me. What do you think is missing?
Oh, I'm just curious. I'm just waiting. I'm so anticipating that I'm nodding.
The word is Hebrew. why is Hebrew the word? I had a delegation from the States. I had the resource center, and there was a teacher there. He said, I've been teaching Hebrew for 20 years. I said, you're fit? He said, but I can't buy in the supermarket in Israel. So I said to him, why? He says, that's not the Hebrew I taught and not the Hebrew they wanted to hear and listen. The Hebrew was the Hebrew of bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, and that's not Israeli Hebrew. Nefesh b'nefesh didn't think it was important. You move to a new country. I think it's important to learn the language. There was not a ulpan on it, not Hebrew on it. Okay, I'm sure people will attend ulpanim and learn Hebrew, but it's like not taken as for granted. I mean, you can manage. I go to a shul with Americans. The kids speak Hebrew. Sorry, if they would, they speak English in the yard. I don't care about the older people, but I care about the kids who were raised here. I know English is a good language. They should know good English. The parents should speak English to them. But when it goes over, and then they go back to the States, and you ask why. How many people do you know here in Israel where the parents live here and the kids are back in the States? They came on Aliyah 30 years ago. The parents are here. The kids. So that's why this word is lacking.
Thank you. That's right.
Okay, I have to say I feel very ambivalent about your presentation. That's putting it mildly, I would say. You presented the two communities as if there's some sort of symmetry between them. But the fact of the matter, that's a total illusion. And I'll explain to you why. Because demographically, the numbers are ostensibly the same, but the situation is totally different. In other words, when you talk about American Jewry, by the way, in my eyes, is one of the biggest failures in Jewish history. It's the biggest graveyard of Jews, bigger than any concentration camp. Okay? More Jews have left the Jewish people through the portals of Ellis Island and the other places that Jews came to than any other place. So that's one thing. And in that respect, that's a reflection of the fact that American Jewry is a community of identity. In other words, it's a voluntary thing. And the problem is, and here's the heart, in my eyes, I think I only fully understood this after I made Aliyah and lived in a majority culture for a change, is that most people don't want to be at odds with their environment. And to be a good Jew, you have to be at odds with your environment. You have a different calendar, you have ostensibly a different language, a different sense of affiliation, etc. And even the Jews that are still in the game, okay, which is nowhere near 5 million Jews, I mean, it's total illusion, that figure, even they, for the most part, or at least a good part of them, feel more allegiance to their American identity than they do to their Jewish identity. So in that respect, I totally disagree with you. Listen, the fact of the matter is that it's in modern times, okay, the question is how can a minority like the Jews succeed? So the truth of the matter is there's no proven formula because it hasn't succeeded anywhere. And the only place it has succeeded is the state of Israel, where it's a community of faith. And the good news is that majority cultures can't commit suicide or don't commit suicide, and that the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who today are alienated Jews can come back at their leisure. In Israel? In Israel, I'm talking about, of course. So...
Challenge that.
Okay. After that, I feel my question is too light. Your remarks are powerful, and I think they're true. I appreciate your talk. I thought it was very, very interesting. But I also have a number of objections and questions. The first one is, since the 60s, we've seen the Americanization of Israel. The whole idea that the Israeli people are simply a community of faith, not a community of individuals, and very, 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 what we'll say, influenced individuals by every trend, every global trend in the world, is strange. Israel today, now let's talk about, he talked about the difficult things coming from the United States. What about the difficult things which are happening in Israel? You have a lot of Israelis how many Israelis, you went to the army. How many Israelis, young people, secular people, are out of the army? You talked about 5 million people standing. How many Haredim stand? You're not talking about 5 million people that stand. You're talking about a much smaller amount of people that stand. 10%.
No, it's not my figure.
Okay, whatever it is, Israel has the problems, aside from all the great communal problems, which no other country in the world faces anything like it. The problems of survival, and it has the problems which every individual faces as an individual who is a free-thinking individual in the world. And that is the most important thing I can say in my remarks. I'll say one more slight thing about American culture and Protestants. America is ceasing to be a Protestant country in many different ways, not simply demographically.
The courts.
It's not simply that. The mentality of the culture, it's also happened in England. The mentality of culture is shifting. It is not that saving, hard work, look to the future mentality. It's a different kind of mentality. It's a different world. The nature of the population is different. Samuel Huntington was very much berated for talking about the change in mentality in America, which is becoming the rise of the Hispanic community in America. But these are big issues. We've spoken about a lot of things. We've asked questions here which no one can solve and no one can answer, and it would take you years to answer. But
and I want to say this last group of 3 questions is exactly why this subject is so important. Folks, you missed the boat completely. You are not listening. I don't know how often a speaker sits down and says it, but this is my experience. This is my experience. I mean, you're in plenty good company. Usually it's Israelis by birth, who have no knowledge of anything outside of Israel and assume that the whole universe is just, Chinese or Chinese-speaking Israelis, and Americans or English-speaking Israelis, and French people. It's not clear what they speak, but it certainly sounds prettier than American English.
I think.
Well, wait. You can't disagree yet. I haven't finished saying what I'm going to say. The problem is not who's right and who's wrong. The problem is not whether theirs is a better Jewish community or ours is a better Jewish community. The problem is that we need them, and they need us. And if you want the proof of this, thank you. If you want the proof of this,
that's true, but that's
look at how birthright works. Birthright is fascinating because I think I have uncovered to some degree something that the people who operate birthright are puzzled by. Why does it have this profound effect? We have research on people who are 10 years after birthright, and they are significantly more committed to the Jewish community. They tend to marry Jewish. They're raising children Jewish. Why? And I would argue that it's because they had suddenly injected into their ideational identity components. They got a sudden injection of sort of vitamin I. I don't know what to call it. The perspective that says, you can be organically Jewish. It can be a natural thing that you don't have to struggle with every day of the week. It can be like it is in Israel. Now, most of my life will not be like that, but I can think of myself in that way, and that's something we learn experientially and not by having a lecture on it in Hebrew school. Why does it work? Because it shows that the interaction with these two Jewish societies that were created almost independently of each other, with very poor levels of communication between them, have produced different forms of Judaism that have opposite strengths and opposite weaknesses. And the encounter is enervating. I have to tell you, I take Israelis to America, and they go into these weird places like Reform synagogues. I know half a dozen shlichim, former shlichim, who came to Israel and joined Reform synagogues after experiencing American Reform Judaism, because to them it opened up a way of thinking of themselves Jewishly. 3 of these families are kibbutz families, 3 of them are in the city. It opened a way of thinking about themselves Jewishly that they had never, ever had the opportunity to consider. About Hebrew, I want to say exactly wrong. As long as we are stuck, I can conduct the rest of this conversation in Hebrew. My law degree is in Hebrew. I actually have read Shimon Agranat in the original. Anybody who's ever seen an Agranat Psak Din knows it's about 50 pages longer than it needs to be. But my point is, if we're going to sit here and explain to ourselves what they are doing wrong, we are never going to listen to them and never going to learn from them what they are doing right. And they are doing an awful lot that's right. And if they keep telling us that we have a barbaric system that corrupts the Jewish religion because we have an established church running it, so they don't have to pay any attention to us, they will never understand what we are doing right. And we can't afford this way of thinking.
Dr. Rettig, you're talking about Dati Judaism terms all the time. You're talking about religious terms all the time.
Not at all.
If you go and study communication at any university, they'll tell you that you have to have a common language. Okay, it can be English, it can be, but language is part of the communication. That's just one example.
Demyanuk knows more Hebrew than 95% of American Jewry.
What?
Demyanuk knows more Hebrew, unless he forgot it, than 95% of American Jewry.
Criminal.
So,
what does that mean?
So
When
what does it mean?
Demyanuk says emunah,
Jewishly.
when Demyanuk says emunah, you know, we had a wonderful illustration of this right now. The difference between me and Professor Yisraeli was not a difference of language. It was a difference, but perhaps a difference of content, although I think we were both trying to say the same thing in different language. But we just had a discussion where we came to a meeting place on language, not in terms of whether we say it in Hebrew or say it in English, because we were arguing about translation, but in terms of the idea we are discussing. Now, I don't care. You can have an American Jew land here who's fluent in Hebrew, or an Israeli Jew, more commonly, go to America who's fluent in English, and they don't understand a darn thing. Most of our shlichim, and I've experienced this in both directions, I helped to train them here, and I experienced them as an American Jew in the States, do not know which way is north. And they tell me, it's tragic, they come back here, they're friends of mine, I meet with them. They tell me I was there for 2 years, the American Jews are lovely, I'm lovely, we got along great, I got the 3rd year on my contract, and you know, about the 9th month into my 3rd year, I think I started to understand what's going on there. But I was already packing to leave. We're not talking about the physical or the letters we write in the language we speak. We're talking about the import vocabulary. When we sit down with American Jews and we say, I'm in favor of Jewish identity, and they say, we're in favor of Jewish identity, and then we have a group hug, and then we walk out, we have done absolutely nothing. And until we form the same content, shared content, and I don't care if it's in Hebrew or in English, that's a secondary discussion. Until we have the same content, we are not going to have a true, honest dialogue. I'm sorry, I ran.
Okay, we have one more round, and I know that there's a few more people who want to contribute. I would like to draw your attention to Dr. Rettig's contact information, and also I'm sure that once you conclude the meeting, he might be for another few minutes, so you can approach him. So last round, Jeff Dauber, Edward Cohen, and Dr. Gerstenfeld. And already now we are around 15 minutes late, so I'm sorry that we can't take more questions. Jeff.
Okay, I'll make this very fast. You just mentioned shared content. But I'm asking this question with the background of the HAC's Cohen-Hellman Beyond Distancing report a few years ago, which was shocking for me, because I am particularly concerned about the younger generation. And I would like to hear from you your projections 20 to 30 years out, not so much about the shared content, but how perhaps the method, the media, influences the way these two communities are going to share that import vocabulary. In other words, how is the Web 2.0 generation now, and yes, I am on Facebook and YouTube and everything else, even though I'm going to be 60 years old next week, but how will that either benefit our two communities, or perhaps because of these online communities, perhaps be to the detriment of that shared vocabulary?
About 25 years ago, I did a course at Hebrew University with Muhammad Ali. Because I was the only one in the class who had a car, I had to pick her up and come home and take her back up. And one morning, I bought the Herald Tribune, and there was an article in there by Jacob Neusner.
They called him Neusner. Yeah, his name was Neusner.
The headline of the article was "America is Babylon." I think I got that right.
I think it's Provincetown is my Jerusalem. It's a famous article.
Okay, so I just read the article. Muhammad came into the car, and I said, "I just read this article. Would you like to read it?" And the whole journey took place. Everything is wrong. Everything is And basically what he was saying is that Israel is the most unsafe place in the world to live. It's the wrong place to live. The best place to live is just like Babylon 2,000 years ago was more important to the Jews. America today is more important to Jewry than Israel, and the future of Jewry in America is not I just want to mention that anecdote and maybe some comment on it. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think it was Yehuda Levi who said the three elements of Eretz Israel, Hebrew language, and Torah Israel. And the second the Jews in Israel are totally immersed in the first two, their language is Hebrew. They study some of the Bible in school in a secular way. They don't practice Judaism, but they have probably a better knowledge of Tanakh than a lot of religious kids in America. So, you have this in America, maybe kids learn more Jewishly. But you could argue that secular children in Israel are somehow more Jewish than religious Jews are in America.
Dr. Gerson.
So maybe the lady just wanted to
so briefly, Victoria, that comment.
I would just, first of all, what you described is sort of my life history. I was raised, some of it, Yiddishkeit. My grandparents were very active in that movement, Shalom Aleichem, workman's circle. My big veterans and adults, they're more or less that. And my grandparents had something definite that they were rebelling against. Whatever you want to call they were doing, it was within a Jewish context. Because they did not pass on the religion to most of their children, I happened to one of the nuclear families that we went to, if anybody, we learned Yiddish, believe it or not. Nothing with God, we learned all their history and culture, it was good. But most of my cousins that are American are not raising Jewish children. 2 generations in, they have married people who did care about whatever religion they were. I have my grandmother's siblings, 3 or 4 of them came to Israel in Tel Aviv in 25, 29. 4 generations of Sabras now. And they're all Jewish, not Dati, any of them. They like candles, okay, they do that. But they're all Jewish because they're here. And that, to me, is just Zionism. That's the difference between Zionism and not. So I just want to say that. On a positive note, as I said, I was part of this more or less delegation funded by Jewish National Fund, Media Watch, organized by Media Watch, and Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, which is a pro-Israel advocacy group on college campuses, and Olive I doing it. The young people in Media Watch, and I'm saying young to me, 30-year-olds, the generation of the 30-year-olds. And I just finished an old barn, 2 weeks. I stayed longer and did that. And there were young people that conversational groups, young Israelis, born here, who were so thoughtful and so understanding of the larger issues that me as a diaspora Jew in America is dealing with, especially on a college campus. I'm a librarian. near Berkeley. I used to be at Berkeley, but it's really bad there right now. I just want to leave it on a positive note. I think I was very impressed with all of the, and some of the people who organize the tours are really halfway between American and Israelis, because they lived in New York working for GANF. They may have American parents, or they were Toronto Canadian parents, but went in the army. They've lived here since they were kids, so they're fluent, really fluent in both cultures and both languages. And when I would start to talk about some of the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic things that are really developing, even in America, which is shocking, heartbreaking for me, they understood because they had a good education in Jewish history. And so I just thought maybe to leave it on a positive note, that I think that the younger, that they may not be all we would always, prescribe for them, but they are living in both worlds because they are so fluent in English and so on. So that's where I want to leave it. And I'm very impressed with the young Israelis I met overall, absolutely. Young as in 30-year-olds.
Very quickly, I must tell you, I don't regard the comments you do as really challenging.
Thank you all for letting me finish.
I think it's much about different parts of what you're making. For example, the difference between hard power that Israel has and soft power, and how the political things dividing American Jewry, not just Christian Jewry, etc. So these are elements that we have to consider that we're able to touch upon. Also, the example of Australia, if I would use that, because the reason Australia, not because they had power, and not because they were communistic, they saw this as part of their military strategy. If they lost that, then they would lose that whole area. I just wanted to say, I said it's not. The final thing I just want to say is, based on the last thing, I think it's just, I think we have to look at American Jewry like a chemical formula that's not stable, and the arrows are going in and the arrows are going out. It's not fair to focus just on the arrows going out, although it's a great concern. There are arrows going in, some examples like that. And on the positive side, including that, I want to say is that you're talking about this has become a very profound concern more and more. So in a sense, the call to arms that they're calling for over the years being picked up, so they're recognizing the enormous difference. And the last thing I want to say is, given the sense that, by the way, you're an acting director, you're a non-acting director?
No, I'm acting.
That's what I was going to say.
You can watch me act.
You want an acting?
Alas, poor your
The last thing I want to say is, since you have choice, you have to choose of what? And values, it's not just a common vocabulary. There's a sense of values in the sense that you think that the absolute question is why. And if they have the values component over there that says, yes, this can be and I think when they get over here out of Israel, they're seeing the best of Israel. Let's understand. The idealistic Israel is what what's getting exposed to, and therefore they're best. Anyway, I want to say, I should go off. Your characterizations were very interesting.
I want to then really quickly answer them. On the issue of beyond distancing and how being close is being all on Facebook and the internet and all this is bringing us. I have to say that unless we settle on a common language of communication, and I don't mean English or Hebrew, I mean common import vocabulary, this is not going to help us to deal with the issues. In fact, it exacerbates it. When you hear so many, and I mean when you read in the Jewish internet comparisons between Arabs in Israel and blacks in the American South in the 1920s, you understand that people do not share an import vocabulary that allows them to discuss these things intelligently, just talking right past each other. So my response to the technology is, like Ben-Gurion said about time, it's neither for us or against us, it depends how we use it. In terms of Provincetown as my Jerusalem, well, we talked about Borg's habit of saying provocative things. Professor Neusner, who has written something like 1,000 books, and is
Really?
Right.
he's written some unbelievable amount.
He hasn't written that.
Edited, compiled, but written.
He's got his name
Oh,
on a gazillion.
right.
I'll use the word gazillion. Has a history of seeking to be provocative. That was a classic example, and a very well-known one. And I think that that's exactly the kind. Don't think I'm critical of Israelis and not critical of Americans. That was the kind of insular, self-serving articulation by an American and Jewish intellectual leader that very well served the purposes and the self-image of an American Jewish intellectual leader. It must be lovely to think of yourself as creating something as important as the Jerusalem Talmud. But that's not addressing the problem that we have now. I want to say something about, he put a little about assimilation. Assimilation cuts in two ways, and we have to understand this. Assimilation is, on the one hand, a sign of social acceptance. Jonathan Sarna always talks about this. Assimilation places us in a really interesting situation that the lady who was sitting here alluded to in regard to her family. American Jewry is so very creative, I would argue, for the same reason that America produced in the Reagan era something like 300 brands of automobiles, where the Soviets produced, I think, 4. And Israel produces much fewer brands, so to speak, of Judaism. When you have a controlled marketplace of ideas, you have fewer ideas. And you have fewer people involved in buying those ideas. When you have a broad marketplace of ideas, and it's highly competitive, yes, you're going to lose a lot more people, but the people who are in have all chosen to be there, and that is a source of enormous power and enormous creativity. And we should not lose sight of that. In other words, if De La Pergola suggests that there are going to be 3.5 million American Jews in 70 years from about 10 years ago, then we have to think, who are they going to be and what are they going to look like? Well, they're going to be a product of this winnowing out of choice. They are going to be people who chose to be in the community, and their Jewish commitments and their Jewish engagement is going to be very high, and we need to take that into account. In terms of using the example of Australia, actually you didn't disagree with me, you said what I said in another way. My point is that the failure of the Jewish people, if we can call it that, in the Shoah, was a starkly political failure, a failure of political organization. The Australians weren't just a bunch of people on an island, they were a bunch of people in a political structure that made the British say, hey, defending those people on the other side of the world is important to us. And it made the Americans say, defending those people on the other side of the world is important to us. It did not make either the British or the Americans or the Soviets at any point in the war say about the Jews in Europe, hey, defending those people on the other side of the world
comparison.
It's not a comparison. It's not objectively.
How can you compare the two of them?
How can I not? Are you suggesting that the Jewish failure was not a failure of political organization? What are we debating?
There's no Jewish state. Come on, there's no Jewish state. There's no mechanism.
Why do you take this as an attack? You're agreeing with me.
That's what he said. That's exactly what he said.
Fine, you have this difficulty
exactly what he
agreeing,
said.
but you're agreeing with me.
No,
you have
based on the criteria you use today.
No, I'm using the criterion of the 1930s and the 1920s, when the Jews wrote about themselves that we have lost our military capacity. We are no longer capable of being heroic warriors. We have to create a new Jew because the old Jew was a failure as a man. You see all this stuff. There's a visit by Masaryk that's captured on film, you know, from those days. He was thrilled because he saw what looked like Jewish Cossacks riding on horses alongside the train. It's a very famous thing. It's in all the documentaries about that period. Why was he thrilled? Because, damn it, Jewish shopkeepers have no business riding horses like real men. Now what I'm saying is, what we see is that those analyses, and the analyses that were based on economics, and the analyses that were based on Jewish culture, were all wrong. and that the mistake or the default in the Jewish community had to do with our ability and indeed our willingness in some cases to access and deploy power. And you can go back and read what people wrote at that time about how by the way, this was across the board. Socialists and social democrats and reforms and ultra-Orthodox, what wonderful people we are because we don't have power, so we can never oppress anybody, and that makes us superior. That went bankrupt with the Holocaust. And so what I'm saying is that both communities took the issue of power and took it seriously. Only they took it in two completely different models. So when your American friend comes and says, get off the Golan Heights, what do you need it for? Not only does he outrage you, because if you're like me, you fought on the Golan Heights and you have friends who died there, but he outrages you because you say, what do you know about the Golan Heights and the meaning of altitude difference in firing artillery shells? What are you? You read about something in the New York Times? I lived it. Now, as long as you make that, what you have are these two methods of thinking about power that are functionally totally different. And we have to find a way to bridge that gap. Finally, on this issue of why be Jewish, I agree with you that what I'm saying is when they come to Israel in birthright, they discover not just the why be Jewish, but they discover that there's a way to be Jewish that doesn't even ask that question in a deep way. Israeli Judaism, if I can call it that, I have to say tends to be shallow. And maybe I'll conclude with this. Think about conversations you've had with Israelis about Jewish identity. They tend to be short. Anachnu datiyim. Anachnu chilonim. And then you go and talk to an American Jew about Jew. Well, you know, I was born in a Reformed family, but around the time of my bar mitzvah, I just decided it wasn't enough. I got to go off.
They're different.
It's a different.
We know that. We didn't need to learn in the treatise.
No, you did because you don't deal with it. The Jewish world has not described this map as a guideline for activity. And so we keep sending the same shlichim, and they go overseas, and they do the same work in America, and nothing comes of it.
The biggest
This
failure.
is because of the failure, I'll use the word, the failure to map out and respect deeply rooted difference. And I would like to invite anybody who would like, it's just 450 pages with footnotes. And it's also great for cracking nuts. And, you know, if you got to prop up your pillow at night, it's also good. It seems to by osmosis.
What is?
My dissertation.
Well, first of all, you have managed to keep people before 40. You have never managed this in 9 years, which is remarkable. I thought that you raised a lot of very, very interesting points, which of course very much more detailed discussion in which I will not enter. There's one point where I really feel I should take exception to this, which is not a religious subject. I also thought till a few years ago that majorities do not commit suicide. I am from looking at certain countries. I know reasonably well and no longer so convinced of that. Anyhow, thanks a lot for doing this and we hope to develop this further.
Amen. I put up the contact info, seriously, if you'd like to continue this conversation, either by phone or by email, please feel free. Thank you.